Hello, everyone. I'm Ruben Espinosa, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. At the onset, I want to thank Insight Higher Ed for facilitating this webinar, and I also want to thank Leah Newsom and Ann Muktana at ACMRS for helping to make this happen. I'm joined today by our three impressive panelists, and honestly, just all around really cool people. So I'm thrilled to be in conversation with them. We have Curtis Austin, Associate Professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at ASU, and the Associate Director of the Humanities Institute here. Jeffrey Cohen, the Dean of Humanities in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at ASU, and Devoney Looser, Regents Professor of English at ASU. And you can read their full and very impressive bios in the link provided for you in the chat. So thank you all for joining us and for sharing your time and expertise. For our audience, I just want to let you know that we will be in conversation until about a quarter till, and then allow for questions in the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar. But you can drop those questions in the Q&A at any point along the way, and I hope you do. All right, so if you take time to read about the current state of the humanities, you will likely come across titles like these. The humanities are in crisis. Humanities on the cutting room floor. Humanities in decline. The end of the English major. The death of the humanities. We might be tempted to chalk it up to doom and gloom, but we do know that it is serious. All of us likely have colleagues and friends at institutions where the cuts to the humanities have left them vulnerable, and indeed, some without departments or even jobs. For many, it means operating in a constant state of precarity. Foreclosing on the humanities also drastically changes the student experience and the human experience. What is the path forward then? What I see at ASU is excitement about the humanities and a very real investment in making legible the value of the humanities, both here and beyond ASU. I want us to explore then why and how this is possible. And I want to begin with you, Jeffrey, because your commitment to advocating for the humanities is, for my estimation, unparalleled. And I'll share a brief anecdote about Jeffrey as an example of this. I won't embarrass you, I promise. While we at ACMRS were preparing to launch our website, Throughlines, which offers an array of free pedagogical tools focused on pre-modern critical race studies, we reached out to you to gauge the temperature at ASU, given the current national climate in relation to CRT and DEI initiatives. Jeffrey's staunch support for our work was unequivocal, and that mattered. I'm deeply grateful for that, but I also know that this is not necessarily the norm beyond ASU. So Jeffrey, what's your best read on the general lack of institutional investment in the humanities at the present moment? And how do you account for the way ASU is bucking that trend? And then maybe Curtis and Devoney, you can weigh in with your own experiences in mind.
Ruben, thank you for that question. Honestly, thank you for the good work that you've done as our director of ACMRS. It's such a pleasure to work with you. And my first quick answer about why the humanities are thriving here, Ruben, Devoney, Curtis, it's because we have such a good collaborative structure here for building upon and amplifying each other's work and enabling things to happen. If cool things happen at ASU, it's because we have faculty who bring their all to leadership and to enabling things among our students and among our communities. Ruben, as a way in, it struck me as you were reading all those doom and gloom article titles, death of humanities, humanities in crisis, etc. Substitute the word democracy for humanities, and they're just as true. And I don't think that's coincidental. At a time when participation in a robust democracy is under attack, participation in an inclusive, affirmative, sometimes utopian vision of the humanities is also in crisis. Right? When we narrow access to humanities, we narrow access to full participation within a democratic affirmative society. We narrow access to the complications of the past, to making them better in the present, to building better futures. And one of the things that I love about ASU, and I think really unites our faculty here, is that we are a mission-driven university. We have a charter that explicitly states that we are to be judged not by whom we exclude, but by whom we include and how they succeed. Our charter also says that we produce knowledge of societal value. That really matters. That's a different kind of practice of humanities that unfolds here. And our obligation is to involve as many students as possible within that practice. And we serve an incredibly diverse student body. In fact, a student body that very much reflects the future of the United States and the future of a thriving democracy here. So I feel like all of the work that we're doing is participating in a wider program of community building and equipping the next generation to really be excited and engaged about the futures they could build for each other. This is a topic I could go on for an hour about, but I'm not. I'm going to cut myself short and just stop and turn it over to my colleagues.
Yeah, Devoney and Curtis, I mean, so yeah, Jeffrey touched on our charter, right? And thinking about the diversity of our students. What is your experience like? How do you get the sense of the humanities at ASU, what's possible? And conversely, what would you like to see?
I'd be happy to start us off. I mean, I think from my perspective, ASU has been incredibly welcoming of public humanities, and that the students have a hunger for what I would label public humanities, and that these have been allowed to grow alongside each other in ways that I think have been really generative. And I can certainly, as Jeffrey said, I could probably talk about this for an hour, but starting there, we can circle back to the actual examples. But I think the sense that when faculty say they want to try something, it's not we always expect a yes, but I don't expect an automatic no. I expect and have received support to do things that are unusual, that don't read as traditional, or that that might be to the side of what was originally imagined as a scholar or teacher mandate. So I love that, the opportunity for innovation. It's a word we use all the time at ASU, maybe a little too loosely, but I have certainly felt that as a scholar, that there's a chance in the classroom, outside of the classroom, to try to do things differently. And some of those things that I've tried have been public facing. And I've found, as I said, students have a real hunger for those. But I'm sure Curtis has a perspective, maybe alongside or to the side of that.
Absolutely. I think my perspective is very similar, if not the same as your own, because our experiences are so similar. You know, the thing that comes to mind when I hear that question, Ruben, is like the access part of what Jeffrey touched on. I am a first generation student, for example, or at least I was a first generation student. I like to think of myself as a student still because I'm still learning. But one of the things that comes along with being first generation students is, you don't know if you can do it.
Mm.
You don't know whether you belong. You don't know if you fit. I've worked at a few other institutions of higher learning before I got to ASU, and it wasn't always clear to first generation students that they did fit. That is the complete opposite at ASU. And so I think when you provide an environment that offers students the opportunity to be who they are, to spread their wings, to allow them to fail and not let that be the end of the world or the end of their academic career, that makes all the difference in the world. I also find that our students come with a skill set that, and I've been doing this for 3 decades, right? Teaching, that is, with a skill set that a lot of first generation students, say 10, 20 years ago, did not have, right? Do they pick it up in high school? Do they pick it up off the street? Do they pick it up from social media? I don't know. But when I provide my students an opportunity to do more than just read the history of slavery, read the history of the civil rights movements. When I say let's kind of, spice it up a little. Let's do a mapping project to see if we can find out more about this particular town. Let's use these digital tools to figure out what the historians haven't already told us. And in my mind, while I'm preparing the syllabus, while I'm doing my own reading, oh man, this is going to be a heavy lift. But what I have discovered is that students who belong, who feel like they belong, who feel like people care about them, not just the faculty, but the administration as well, they have far more answers than we think. So what we have to do is ask good questions. And when we ask good questions, the students tend to take it from there. So my experience at ASU has been that if you allow it, students will rise to the occasion. Now, does every student make an A in my class? Of course not. But a lot of students who thought that they couldn't pass, because I do this survey at the beginning of the class and say, what do you think you're going to get based on looking at the syllabus? A lot of students, think, oh, I'm going to see, I'll be all right, pretty average. Overwhelmingly, those people who said that wind up with an A. Why is that? Because we help them see their place, not just in the humanities, not just at the university, but in the world. And I think they can appreciate that. And I'm talking about first generation students, but if you are a student who comes from a well-to-do family and you have, a father as a doctor or a mother as an astronaut, these students are operating on the same level. They can see that we want their success to be our goal. And they kind of take it from us. I have learned, and I say this to my students, about half of what I know, I learned from my students, right? Now, when the next class comes along, I pretend like I knew it, I learned in grad school or something like that. I don't say, student X or Y taught me this. But the point that I'm trying to make is that in our humanities classes, when we allow students to think not just outside the box, but to create their own boxes, then that's where the real learning starts. And I say the real learning starts because I've had people who take my classes time and time again, and that learning continues. And so that's my take on that. Now I'll just add about the one point that Devoney made about, being able, as faculty, being able to do some of the, I don't know, you just call them quirky things that we like to do. And I'll say, I've only been at ASU for 4 years. I always get a yes. And maybe that time is running out. I don't know. The honeymoon might be over after this after this session. But I have had some ideas that were shot down by people in the past and got to ASU, asked whether I could do it. And there was just a green light, a green carpet, let us know how things go kind of thing. And I think when you have an administration that is responsive like that, you then get faculty who can experiment in their classrooms in ways that they could not if they felt constrained.
But Curtis, isn't that the kind of world you want to live in, right? Where people in general say yes, let's try it. If it fails, whatever, we'll try something else. But in general, say yes, give it a try.
That is the world I would like to live in.
And I think it's a world we're creating, kind of for the students as well. I think when students come with an idea, faculty who are being told yes are more likely to tell a student yes. And it is a yes mindset, a don't kill the enthusiasm mindset that I very much appreciate and feel that I live in ASU Humanities.
And Devoney, thanks for bringing it back to students, because the one other thing I wanted to say, and Curtis, you get this so exactly right. I've taught at a lot of different universities and colleges. I've been fortunate to be able to do that. And there are many places where I've been, say, a guest lecturer in a class where all the students were pre-selected before they even walked through the door, meaning that, when 8% of a student population is admitted to a college, they're all going to succeed, right? It's already all set up for them. That's kind of a given. We work in a different atmosphere. We work and in general just say yes to anyone who's motivated enough to want to try it out and study with us. And Curtis and Devoney, I'm sure you found the same thing in your classes, that students respond to that attention by upping their game and suddenly realizing that they can do everything that these other so-called elite students had already been preordained to do. No, students just need an infrastructure, some support, and then somebody who says, I know you can do it, and then off they go.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jeffrey. And I mean, I think what Curtis in responding to Devoney's observation, right? I share your experiences. I think that people tend to say yes to me here, which is exciting, and I do think that trickles down to the students, right? But I mean, what comes to mind for me with the charter and coming here from a border town, right, is that there's a real sense of an ethics of hospitality at ASU, and I love that dimension to it, the way that transfers into the classroom with our students. And what we can do therein, I think is important. And more than that, I think, speaks to the success of humanities here at ASU. And I want to circle back, Devoney, to something you mentioned, because I'm curious here. You had a great piece in the MLA. It's a wonderful piece on public-facing humanities, right? And you were candid about the resistance to that from colleagues and friends, right? People in the field, what they might think. But the difference in terms of the public-facing research versus what you're talking about, the public humanities in the classroom, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like in the classroom, how your students experience it, what value you find and they find within that?
Absolutely. And the piece that you're referring to, I think, is the Hows and Whys of the public humanities, which was in
Right.
Profession, MLA's journals. Yeah, that piece is one that I continue to reflect on, and I have some more work coming out in the next 6 months on reflecting on public humanities, including in a new journal called Public Humanities that's coming out from Cambridge University Press. I want to make sure people are paying attention to that. Part of a scholar-facing conversation about what public humanities, broadly speaking, might look like. But resistance has certainly been part of the package, and I don't think anybody in this audience is going to be surprised to hear that. And I think maybe because as scholars, we think that speaking to the smallest group of people is doing the deepest, most brilliant work. And I really am grateful to be working at a time where that's being reframed, because I think that benefits our students very much as well, to think, okay, I'm writing this paper for my professor. I don't think we have to be in that mindset anymore. I think we can be, and many of us are already, in a more multimodal mode of teaching. And even if we ourselves aren't doing it, and this comes back to what Curtis was saying, you don't have to be an expert in something to teach it. I am certainly not a podcast expert, but I have been making a point of taking my students to our makerspace and showing them, here is a place where they can teach you how to make a podcast. Everyone has to start from a ground, somewhere. Everyone starts somewhere. And I think we often imagine the public humanities as an op-ed in the New York Times. That is nice. I've had exactly one of those so far in my career. I don't know if there is a second, but if that's what we're calling public humanities, then very few people do more than a few thousand words of that in their careers. Public humanities, I think we need to start imagining as writing that is pitched outside the academy. And students are actually much more excited about this, in my experience, than many of our colleagues, which is the moment we find ourselves in. And I think we should take advantage of that and maximize that and do what we can to bring our colleagues who might be resistant along for what I think is really a very fun and fruitful ride.
Yeah. Yeah, and this gets to the question of, I think, the public perception about the humanities, and I'm wondering if you all can speak to what strategies you might offer for those who want to think about public-facing work on the one hand, right, but also reaching broader audiences and making legible, right, why the humanities matter, as it were, right. And I think Devoney, you point to particular outlets, right, where we might be discussing this in an echo chamber, it feels like here, right? But I think, by thinking more broadly, right, what can we be doing? What should we be doing as we're looking outward?
Everything. I mean, the problem is there's no easy formulaic way to hit as many audiences as possible. So we have to try everything and see what works. And for some of us, that means being on social media. For some of us, that means participating in periodical culture that reaches a much more general audience. For others, it's giving talks in communities or being part of community knowledge-making projects. It can be as simple as sharing the work that we value across the various platforms that we're in as a way of signaling that this matters. I was never a fan of LinkedIn until I started to share my colleagues' work on LinkedIn and see the ways in which it allowed that work to travel. Sometimes it would hit 1,000 eyes that it wouldn't have hit otherwise. And I was just think, okay, that's great. That's all the more reason to take a platform that I thought was probably not one for academic content and to rethink it as a way to make our knowledge visible across various communities that LinkedIn happens to bring together. And I think all of us are part of spaces where we can do that. But I I don't know that there's a magic way to try to get a spotlight on what we're doing other than to keep on trying everything that's at our disposal.
And I would just add to that, um, it's just facing up to reality, right? Our world is a real world. Wonderful things happen in our world, and terrible, awful things happen in our world. And I don't think it's helpful for any of us, but especially of our students, um, to keep those bad things off the radar.
Mm.
And I'll just as an example, the Humanities Institute is working with a small Black community called Randolph, about 60 miles south of Phoenix, that was started in the 20s and 30s by folks who came over from Arkansas and Oklahoma, Louisiana, to pick cotton, right? And they did that until Arizona found other ways to make money. Um, but that community is still there, and that community has been suffering from environmental racism, from exclusion, from marginalization, and they asked for ASU's help on this. And ASU supported them in their fight against um, being more, marginalized and polluted, right? And they won that fight, right? And it wasn't a good feel for SRP. SRP, for those of you who are listening and don't know, it's the Salt River Project, right? And all we did was told the story.
Mm-hmm.
And they were so afraid that they were going to lose something, SRP was, that they were doing various and sundry things to keep the story from getting out. Of course, it did make the newspaper. It did make the nightly news. We have been celebrating the victory on campus. But what we found is they were very appreciative of it. SRP wound up funding to the tune of something like $2 million, a whole host of scholarships. They've started to build sidewalks. They've installed um, fire hydrants. They have gotten so much positive publicity from the truth being told about what happens there that they never would have gotten had they won this fight, right? They never would have gotten that. And I'm talking about that because it actually was one of our students who helped us get the word out about
Mm.
it. We have a student named Kevin. I won't mention his last name for confidentiality purposes, but he is involved in making this mapping project of not just Randolph, but the area that is now being used not just by SRP, but I think the other big electrical power company is ARS or something like that in Arizona, to kind of um, track the future of what they can provide to low-income residents, not just in Maricopa County, but throughout the state of Arizona. And so my point here is we have to have the courage to teach. We have to have the courage to face reality. And when we don't know, as Devoney pointed out, we have to have the courage to believe that our students can do things that we cannot. And through this mapping project, we have learned so much about not just this town, but the history of that area. And so I'm a historian. As you said something about podcasting earlier, I have no idea how to do a mapping project, but I learned
Yeah.
during this process. And I had no idea. I thought, hey, they came here to pick cotton. That was it. Well, Arizona produces so much. You think California produces a lot of produce, vegetables, fruit, and so on and so forth. I've learned so much about what this state has been involved in, not just in the region, but in the world in terms of exports, that I never would have come across had it not been for this student who came with the skill set and who learned along the way how to share these maps and say, okay, here's the cotton, here's the year, here's who's involved, but what is the deeper story? And when we get into those deeper stories, we've started to find out that folks who are now CEOs, other higher ranking individuals at SRP had family involved in some of these, and they didn't even know it, right? So now it's a win for all of us. Of course, nobody wants their air polluted, right? Nobody. It doesn't matter your race, your color, your economic status. Nobody wants that. But now that we know what the story is, everybody is on board to fix things. And I think we're just going back to the public facing part of humanities. I think it's more than just telling a public story. It's actually doing something about the stories we hear. And I think the Randolph Project is an excellent example of people from the community, faculty from the university, students from the university getting together saying, how can we help? And again, it's been a win for everybody. And I feel like that is a great public facing example of the type of work that ASU is doing.
And Curtis, you gave a much better answer than I did, because you actually named the very process through which we multiply impact, right? I think everyone in this Zoom today is a good teacher, and we teach classes where students leave feeling like they're enabled to do something. While through programs like the public history program in your school, we have had students go out into Arizona and tell a much more complicated story about how the state came to be and what better futures it might have. And our impact has been profoundly amplified through the students we've trained, equipped, and given the agency and the enthusiasm to go out and do this change-making work in the public humanities.
Yeah, Curtis.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think you also touch on something that I've been impressed by here at ASU is the commitment to social justice, right? To the work in our research and in the classrooms translating to a sense of social justice. And in this regard here, right? I know here at the center, you know, what we're working on in terms of racial justice as well, and the support for that has been great. And so I want to get your thoughts on this facet of the current tenor in the US. You know, Jeffrey, you have the correlation between the decline of the humanities and decline in democracy, right? And thinking about where we are in this, you know, election cycle, you know, the last many years, and thinking about the animosity surrounding race. And I want us to talk candidly about this, because there is an attack on CRT, there is an attack on DEI initiatives, and I'm curious about the correlation between that and the decline of the humanities. But secondly, like where you see the value of that. And Curtis, I'm looking at you, but also Devoney and Jeffrey as well here, right? For our students and having that as part of their humanities experience, those conversations.
Ruben, the one thing I'll just say very quickly is I actually don't buy into the decline narrative for democracy or humanities. I think it can be very useful for certain entities to put out that both things are in decline, but I don't see it. I actually feel like humanities are vigorous. They're just not always practiced in the places that we're used to seeing them. So maybe generally across the nation, fewer students are humanities majors. That doesn't mean that fewer people in the United States are engaging with humanities thinking and or love the humanities and value it. I think there's a lot that's going out there, and Devoney's emphasis on doing it on that public work is really resonating and helping to build. The same with democracy. I feel that we do have the majority of people in this United States are dedicated to a healthy democracy. There is a small number of voices who are challenging it and would like to diminish it, honestly, right, would like to diminish our ability to imagine creatively what a more just future could be, would like to put a halt to the kinds of curiosity that propel both democracy and the humanities, would like to diminish us as communities. And I do feel that there is, I guess in order to retain my optimism, I must believe that there continues to be a large number of people who are dedicated to being against some of the foolishness that's out there that would diminish democracy, other human communities, the humanities, all of these things. But the flourishing of difference is so important across every one of these themes that we're talking about here. So that's my very general take on it. But I know these are really, these have been, the one other thing I'll say, these have been incredibly tough times. I've watched, even as especially faculty of color have been bullied like crazy by certain exterior entities who try to attack them for the kinds of challenging work that they're doing. But hopefully, they feel we all feel supported enough to continue to do that challenging work despite the bullying. It's not going to be enough to make most of us shut up, I'll say that.
Yeah, yeah.
This is very true. And our students certainly aren't going to be shutting up, not in my experience. And so, yeah, that's why I find it important to face whatever issues we're dealing with as a society, and specifically in the classroom head on. I teach the history of the civil rights movement, for example, and so for me, it's very important to on the very first day of class to establish that respect is going to rule the day. We're going to disagree, not because of our race, not because of our economic status, but because we're human beings. Like, we're going to disagree at some point between now and the next 14 weeks. Like, I let them know that. But we let folks also say what it is they think. But then we ask them to do some critical self-reflection. Why do you think that? Where did that thought process come from? And over a period of weeks, you can see the student begin to think, well, perhaps that wasn't an original thought of my own. That came from someplace. And so again, I think respect is hugely important. Active listening, hugely important. I mentioned earlier, I feel like I learned half of what I know from my students. I've changed my mind on lots of things, hearing from students who are far more conservative than me. I mean, I am left, right, in terms of my political outlook. But that doesn't make me right. And so when I come into the classroom with my own ideas, I read the stuff that generally I agree with, and I hear a student ask this really hard question, and I then have to give them the respect that, you know what, maybe I'm thinking about this in a way that is not productive. And so having empathy for students, having empathy for yourself. And I'm talking about as a faculty member, that sometimes we don't always get it right. That creates an atmosphere where people can then solve real problems. So I mentioned that I teach civil rights just as an example. I had a very conservative white male student in my classroom who, didn't really vibe with the kinds of things I was teaching, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and marching and voting rights. And, Black people are getting far more than their share as far as he was concerned. And there was a tug of war for weeks and weeks and weeks. But, I get paid to do a job, so I kept doing it. This person who gave me, I'm just going to call it holy hell, wound up making an A in the class. Um, a couple years later, I get an email saying, hey, thank you for the opportunity to learn. I'm now a civil rights lawyer. And well, like, I never would have saw that coming, but because we established an atmosphere of respect, he was willing to say what he thought, which was, not fun to hear, right? If you're me, like, I grew up, as you can see, Black in Mississippi. I come to any space with a certain perspective. He didn't want to hear what I was saying. I didn't want to hear what he was saying. We listened to each other. I learned something new. I changed my mind about a couple of things. And again, I now have a former student who in the 1950s probably would have led the Ku Klux Klan, but it's now one of the best civil rights lawyers going. So I think that, again, handling those hard things, creating a situation, as a historian, showing we didn't just start having this discussion, and it didn't just start in the 1960s. Let's go back before the founding of our country. What was going on in Europe? What was going on in Asia? What was going on in Africa? And how does that affect what it is we're trying to deal with today? And how do we avoid making the same mistakes our predecessors made? When students feel like they can be themselves, they can make arguments that make sense to them, then I think you have a situation where you have more than one right answer, right? And I think that's okay, because when I first started this job, I thought the right answer was the one I came with, right? I no longer believe that.
Yeah. No, I deeply appreciate the respect you show to your students, Curtis. And before continuing with that, I just keeping an eye on the time. We're going to open the Q&A in about 10 minutes, so make sure if you want to drop a question in there, you can do it. You can do it now, anytime in between that. But coming to that, Curtis, I mean, your work lends itself to have these important conversations in the classroom, whether they are met with resistance or not, right? Those experiences, that's like an amazing story. Jeffrey, looking at you and thinking about medieval studies, and Devoney thinking about Jane Austen. I teach Shakespeare. These are some pretty canonical writers, but I know 1 to 3 of us, right? We broach these topics of race and racism. What has your experience been like with students, engaging with those topics? Because again, I mean, Jeffrey, I also appreciate your optimistic outlook on democracy and the humanities, but the reality is there's a lot of legislation in place right now that is disallowing some of our colleagues to even discuss these topics within their classrooms. And so can you speak to the value of bringing those conversations into the classroom, into your classrooms in particular?
Devoney, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think this is crucial. And I want to just pick up on a couple of words to bring them back into the conversation, words that Jeffrey and Curtis have used. These are really difficult and painful conversations in the world and in the classroom. And I think the kinds of respect and empathy that Curtis was talking about, the kinds of optimism that Jeffrey brought up, need to be part of the mix. I think in the humanities, we've been really good at argument and at critique, and no question that's needed. No question. I think everyone here acknowledges that that has been our bread and butter. We're good at that, and it's needed in the world. But I think at the same time, we need enthusiasm, we need storytelling, and we need some positive paths for potential change, even if we don't always believe in that ourselves on any given day. I think our students are hungry for that. They are hungry to imagine that these texts, that this history we teach, as ugly as it may be, is informing something that could be going forward, that could be better. And I think it's hard as someone who's trained in a very ugly and 18th and 19th century moment that also has some beauty, that we try to keep these things in our heads and in our hands and in our students' minds as best we can at the same time. And that sounds very Pollyanna, but I think it can also be a rhetorical choice and a classroom choice to try to keep the focus on, as ugly as this history is, and we need to recognize it, there could be a different future before us.
And Devoney, one of the things I've loved about your public work is, you look at what's ugly, but you also look at the alternatives that existed at that very moment that maybe we didn't know enough about, or we didn't know enough about the author's family being invested in. Racism and colonialism, but also abolitionists and being against slavery. So I feel like one of our jobs is to, yes, of course, we want our students to have better lives and better futures and all that. We'll set them up for it. But one of the ways that we can best do it is often by getting them to understand the past is a much more complicated expanse.
Yes.
Yeah, where so many of the stories that have been told or have been received by them are so attenuated that they're almost meaningless. But the past is filled with contradiction and possibility. We've worked very hard, maybe because of our own senses of insecurity, to make it seem as if we're so much smarter than any generation that's ever lived before us. That's not really fair to human history. Humans have always been smart, inventive, creative. There's been so much possibility so long as we've been imagining. That's what the humanities is all about. It's not about revering tradition, right? It's not about worshiping something from the past, but it's coming to understand the past as a field of complexity with all kinds of alternatives, many of which we've forgotten, and sometimes reconnecting to that and using those as tools to open up more humane futures. And, Ruben, maybe just the one other thing I'll say is, and because that's dangerous, then you get educational systems like those in Florida that want to shut down the amount of knowledge that you're allowed to access. Like, what an insane world where we are officially banning books and subjects and taking courses. What?
Yeah.
It really does show the power and the danger of, for example, humanities studies. It will open up your future in ways that some people might not be pleased. They don't want there to be possibilities.
Yeah, yeah, and what I recognize too in terms of ASU and the people in the Zoom is their commitment also to collective effort to change not the dynamics simply here at ASU, right? But the academy at large. I think there is a concerted desire to take this ethos that we have here, right, and transplant it elsewhere in terms of hopefully, right, something that is better, especially in regard to these important conversations about the past. That too, though, I want to circle back in thinking about the public humanities, right, is not intuitive. And Curtis, you mentioned this too with your student doing the mapping, right? This is something you have to train yourself. We are often not trained to be, public facing in our work, and that sense of foreclosure, how we are supposed to speak here, right? What are our audiences? I think can maybe feel a little bit overwhelming as people venture into this. So I just want to say I appreciate, Jeffrey, when asked this question, you talk about the capaciousness of thinking about public facing work here, right? It doesn't have to be, kind of large scale in this regard, but we can think about these smaller avenues. I'm also curious, and you can, any of you can weigh in. Devoney, I'm thinking of you in particular because you've thought about this and written about audiences, right, and who we imagine our audiences are. And this is something that I will fault ourselves in an ACMRS as we were putting together through lines. We had a very specific audience in mind, and it would be professors who were thinking about wanting to bring in critical race studies into their classrooms but didn't know where to begin. This would offer a tool for that. And in some of the promotional material that we have for this, we began to advertise, and it was amazing to see the amount of engagement with some of these pieces. And so we had one scholar who's just fantastic, one of my favorite scholars in early modern studies, Ian Smith, who's thinking about race in Hamlet. But in the process of interviewing him, he talked about, the difference between a Black man coming from Jamaica, right, and arriving in the US. And he had this very poignant moment where he says, I didn't become Black until I landed in the US. And it is this recognition of seeing himself and how he was seen here, right? This is out. We put it on social media, on Google. This has got thousands of comments, and it was this conversation among, Black Americans and Jamaican descent here, right, who were talking about their experiences, and it somehow became this moment of a conversation that we did not anticipate, right, but that is out there. And I think as we begin to consider audiences here, right, this goes a long way in changing, I think, public perception about the humanities. It's something that you were getting at, Jeffrey, I think, right? And Curtis yourself, I mean, now, you have in these communities, right, a recognition of something fantastic happening at ASU that then, affects these lived experiences. This, I guess my question, to all three of you is, how do we make this legible to really our colleagues, those in attendance at today on Inside Higher Ed here, right? How do they go about this, and aim for these bigger audiences with confidence?
I'll be happy to start. I mean, I think one thing is start small. And I talked about that a little bit in the piece that you mentioned, Ruben, the Hows and Whys of Public Humanities, starting small. But also I want to pick up on something Curtis said earlier. He and I have talked about how we're both first generation college. And I think there have been lots of disadvantages to that, but some advantages too, in that if I want to talk to my family about academic work, I am already doing a kind of talking across. And I think that's where we really need to start reframing, those of us who are not yet doing public humanities in whatever way we want to define that, those of us who are doing primarily scholar-facing work, or in our classrooms, perhaps imagining ourselves still as the expert talking to the learners, that we need to come to more understandings about what it means to talk across. And your example of through lines, Ruben, is really beautiful there. And the way to talk across is to start trying. So if you say you want to write for general audiences, write something and give it to somebody who is in that general audience you're imagining. I mean, it's so obvious. We do it with our scholarly work, we do it with our students, and as we learn to teach. But I think we need to do more of this, checking our ideas, testing our ideas on the audiences we want to hear us. I think this will help the reputation of the humanities. It will help the sense of what it is that we do. The more that we speak beyond the academy to groups that I think are already invested in the kinds of ideas we're talking about, they just maybe aren't hearing from us as co-learners and as differently situated experts.
Devoney, thank you for using that word co-learners, right? Because I think part of what we sometimes forget, and Curtis, you got at this earlier, is if we cannot model being engaged over a lifetime with changes in the field, changes in direction, changes in possibility, then there is not going to be any vitality in our fields. We have to model for the public what it means to be inquisitive, curious, always stoking our imagination, always wondering about, is there a better way to do it? Is there a way to do it that's new? I get so tired of colleagues who just complain that, they're not being listened to, they're not being attended to. It's like, we have PhDs, we're smart people, like we're trained to do hard things. One of the hard things that I think is our mutual mission in support of each other nationwide, actually internationally, is to make sure that the humanities feel engaging, relevant, welcoming. I said earlier that there's not a crisis in humanities, really, in that almost everyone enjoys something having to do with the humanities every day. We all love story, right? We all love history. How do we capture that enthusiasm and bring it back into our classrooms, bring it back into our majors? So if there is a way forward for our colleagues who are at places where diminishing enrollments are leading to the closing of programs, I think part of it is just reactivating the enthusiasm that's there instead of killing it. We really have to be exuberant learners who model that for others in order to bring others into our communities.
And Jeffrey, I'm familiar with the measures you took to change the decline in enrollment to the humanities here at ASU when you arrived. But can you speak? The audience might not be in. Can you speak? One of the questions is asking specifically that, right? Wanting to hear more ideas about measures we can take to draw students who might otherwise feel compelled to major in business or STEM subjects. If we can't turn around those enrollments, then departments will be lost at different institutions, which is already happening in some cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, can you speak about what strategies you might offer, what measures you took to turn this around?
Yeah, so when I arrived at ASU in 2018, we were starting to see a dip in humanities enrollments. It reflects what's going on nationwide. I get that. Students are scared. They're worried. If they commit to a major, they want to know that there's some kind of career outcome, and especially at a university. We're a Hispanic serving institution. Many of our students are first generation. They come in here with the hopes and dreams of their communities pinned to their shoulders. They want to know that the investment is going to pay off. So we integrate career learning into everything we do. I'm teaching right now English 300, Your Degree in the World. It's about how English majors get jobs. I bring alumni back in. Students learn how to write a good resume, how to network, all of this. They actually learn that everything they've learned through their humanities courses has an articulatable job skill attached to it, and they make the connections with alumni. So there's that. Another thing is, I'll hold up my Humanities Week Frisbee. What's more fun than a Frisbee? Humanities Week is a week that we have, third week of October. It's the 5th time we're doing it at ASU. Next week, it is a campus-wide celebration of humanities. My objective that week is to make sure there's not a single person on the ASU campus who isn't confronted with a celebration of the humanities in some way during that week, where it is just made public that this is a place where the humanities matter. So we have all kinds of talks, we give away swag, we make it exciting, and we really emphasize that studying the humanities is engaging and fun. We do a lot of work around marketing. If you look at our website for the humanities, I think it's humanities.thecollege.asu.edu, you'll see we worked really hard to answer any question any student will have about, well, if I study this, will I get a career? The answer is yes. And I think just as importantly, if I study the humanities, will I live a good life? Good meaning like it feels good, it feels ethically grounded, but also will I accomplish good in the world? The answer is yes. So we try really hard to give our students all of the language they need to explain the choice of why they are studying what they love to others who might not understand it. And we've worked really hard on messaging and marketing. And then finally, for grounding the faculty that we have here. I was very fortunate, Devoney, you were here already, and you are such a great example of what the humanities can be. We tried to do hiring that keeps our strengths going. Ruben, you joined us a little bit later. Curtis, you joined us later. I mean, we wanted students to be able to see at the front of their classroom future versions of themselves. We wanted students to be able to say, these classes are relevant to me, even if they're in something that maybe, you know, Ruben, when you teach Shakespeare, you teach it in a way very different, I think, from the way maybe it was taught to you. That truly matters here. We want everybody to find their way into humanities study is what it comes down to. So those are some of our strategies.
I know that's fantastic. And this next question from the audience dovetails with that. And then Curtis and Devoney, maybe you can weigh in. And the question is, how do you maintain your enthusiasm and optimism and hope within the face of governmental laws prohibiting these discussions on college campuses?
That is a hard question to answer, but I would say it to some degree it is a performance and a choice, but I also want to retain hope. And I think just I see there's a question in the chat about applied humanities, and I want to make sure we do a little bit with that. To add to that, internships, students who've done internships give me hope, and who some of those internships are off campus, but I started to realize actually I can be an intern coordinator. Like I can do internships with students. So I have put together modern editions of 18th and 19th century texts with groups of students, graduate students and undergrads who are doing it as interns. And that kind of work also gives me hope in the face of a lot of things that are not so hopeful. But yeah, I think it's a choice, and it's not one that is easy to make on a daily basis, obviously.
And Devoney, just as a little footnote to that, when it comes to internships, so the English department tried this out, and I'm going to have every humanities school do it. There's an internship coordinator who's a full-time staff member in English. 92% of the students who go through the internship program graduate with a job in their English majors. 92%. We track it statistically because they get, and it's not a job that comes directly from that internship. It comes from the fact that we have an internship coordinator who really cares about them, helps them capture those skills, get them on a resume, and be able to speak about them and get their jobs. So no one worries about having a job when they've gone through an internship that really matters.
Yeah, and I want to say her name. It's Ruby Maxud, and she's been
so good.
incredible. And she has made it possible for me to imagine myself as someone who could work with interns. My research is now collaborations with students, at least part of it, all the time.
And I would say, in answer to that question of how, I would say just keep it interesting for the students. Make sure you're bringing in diverse readings, diverse voices, so on and so forth, right? So again, I teach the history of the Black freedom struggle, and one of the organizations I focus on is the Black Panther Party. And what people know about the Black Panther Party is that there are these big, bad, mean guys carrying around guns, and they want to kill all the white people. All right, that's what they come to my classroom with in general. And when I, show them that the Black Panther Party literally could not have existed without white support, then their understanding is different and their questions are different. When I explained to them that it wasn't Eldridge Cleaver or Bobby Seale or Huey Newton who came up with the famous Panther logo, but it was a young woman college student at Clark Atlanta University who drew that and who never got credit for it, then that's a new way of learning about something you thought you already understood. So I talk about the life of Martin Luther King a lot in my classes, but then I introduce Bayard Rustin, who, turns out he wasn't a straight person. You know, he was someone who considered himself as gay. Well, he is the person who had to convince Martin Luther King Jr. that you can't go around talking about nonviolence and you've got a house full of guns, right? You can't just say it. You have to actually do it and be it. And without his input, without his instruction, there wouldn't have been a March on Washington in 1963. And so when students, are able to sink their teeth into these different perspectives and different understandings of history that they've heard, it just changes the entire dynamic. All of us, for example, have heard of the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision, right? Linda Brown's father filed this suit on behalf of his daughter. Well, if you go and read the story of the Brown family, the last thing they wanted was to leave their thriving Black school and integrate with the white school system that wasn't doing so well, right? That's the last thing they wanted to do. But people like Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston, these huge NAACP lawyers, outsized egos, outsized influence, encouraged them to do that. And you get the Brown decision, but when you go back and see what's happening in Topeka, Kansas after 1954, there's no integration there. Yeah. They keep doing the same thing. And people are shocked to learn that there are places in this world, in the South, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, where Black people didn't want to go to school with white people, right? And so now you have a diverse perspective on a topic that most of us feel like we already have a really tight handle on. And I think, Ruben, the answer is be different, be diverse. Here's a story we know a lot about, but do we know the whole story? Yes, Rosa Parks was tired. Yes, she didn't want to give her seat that day in December of 1955. But nobody asked what this 40-something-year-old woman was doing for the 20 years before that. Well, what she was doing was actually investigating rape cases in rural Alabama, and not just like, I don't even know if there's a such thing, but this is what's coming to mind. Run-of-the-mill rape cases. These were cases where Black women are being raped by police officers and sheriff's deputies. Who in their right mind would be going around rural Alabama trying to out people like this?
Mm.
So we're not just talking about a tired woman. We're talking about a person committed
Yeah.
to humanity, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of what it is. And I think when you share these kinds of stories with our students, no matter what kind of background they're coming from, race, class, whatever, they then see the value of learning this humanities subject. Like, at the end of the day, in their minds and in mine, when I learn these things, hey, I've been lied to. And I don't like that. And so I'm going to investigate things further from now on. And these are the kinds of students we're creating so that the world will be better, not so our classrooms or our campuses can be better. And I just think if you just keep it different, keep it diverse, it'll keep working. Because nobody, I mean, how many times did we hear about Rosa Parks before we graduated from high school? But we never heard the whole story. How many
Yeah.
times did we hear about the Black Panther Party? Well, they're a bunch of scary dudes, but we never heard the whole story. And I'll end with this. Like, I gave a talk on the Black Panther Party, a TED talk. It got over 1 million views. And, when you get more than 1 million views, you get certain phone calls and people are offering you things. And, do you want to come and get on our speaker circuit? And hey, listen, I like money just as much as the next person, right? I'm not trying to be modest here, but I think that what's more important is the brain power of our youth and not the economic power in my wallet. And so I have said no 10, 20, 30 times since that TED Talk hit over 1 million to people saying, come and work for us, because yeah, somebody else is, maybe another 1 million people will listen to that TED Talk and it'll be 2 million. But if I continue to teach and share these kinds of stories with my students, look how much impact that's going to have versus what it could do for me personally.
Right. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's precisely what it's about, is our students. And forward-looking in that regard. So, you know, you give us all three of you gave us a lot of reason for hope for the future of the humanities, and I want to thank you sincerely for taking the time out today. It's a great conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it, and thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.